So today our webinar, as you probably know, as you probably realized, is on reptiles and amphibians of Kentucky, which of course is a really fascinating subject matter, being as there's such a high diversity of some of those critters, right? And we're very fortunate to have Dr. Stephen Price with us today. Very cool presentation. I'm really excited about it again, and I know that you all are going to enjoy and you're going to love being able to have Dr. Price as a resource for all your reptile and amphibian questions. So before we actually get started with Dr. Price's presentation, um, a few things to keep in mind. We are in a webinar, so there's no options for audio, video, that kind of thing. But when you look down at the bottom of your screen there, you are going to see options to Q&A or chat. If you have any questions for Dr. Price during the length of this presentation, you can put them either into the Q&A box where they'll go directly to the panelist, or you can put them in the chat if it's something that you want to kind of share with the general group. So if during the course of this, if you end up having any tech issues, if you feel like something's going sideways, you should have my email since I sent you the link this morning. And I'll be monitoring my email, so you can hop on there, or if you're able to, you can message me on Zoom and just let me know what's going on, and I will do my best to get that fixed for you to the best of my abilities, or pull in Renee if it's something real serious. So having said all that, I do want to tell you just a little bit about our speaker of the day, Dr. Price. First of all, well, I won't steal all of his thunder, of course, but if you are not familiar with Dr. Price's work, and you've not gone on the Price Lab website before, I highly recommend that you start there. It's very cool. I'll stop sharing and let him go ahead and bring up his slides here. But that's an awesome place to start if you're interested in the reptiles and amphibians of Kentucky, an incredible resource with some incredible resources linked on it. So for sure, check that out. And we'll go into that a little bit more in the course of this presentation. And I can pull that up again at the end if you want the web address for it or the QR code. But just a little bit about Dr. Price as he's pulling up that presentation. He is a professor of stream and riparian ecology in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at the University of Kentucky. He received his BS and MS both in environmental science from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, and has a PhD in biology from Wake Forest University. So he is a wildlife biologist, and his research focuses on the conservation and management of aquatic and semi-aquatic animals. And as you might have guessed, it especially focuses on reptiles and amphibians. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Price, and we will learn about some reptiles and amphibians. I'm very excited.
All right. I appreciate that introduction, Anna. Can you guys see my slides okay? I just want to make sure.
Yes, everything looks great.
Okay, good. So I'm really excited to talk to you all today about amphibians and reptiles of Kentucky. They're obviously my favorite group of animals to study, and I've spent lots of time in Kentucky learning about their ecology and ways to conserve and manage for these animals. So the focus of today's talk will be largely just on some general information about reptiles and amphibians, how these organisms operate, how they work. I'll do a little bit of general ID. I obviously can't go through all the species of Kentucky today. I think each group would require its own webinar or several webinars to do that, but I'll focus on a few species and those that folks I think may be interested in. And then as I'm going through these different groups of species, I'll bring up some management conservation strategies for reptiles and amphibians. So most of us are familiar with these charismatic wildlife, right? We see things like white-tailed deer and bears sleeping in trees. They're so cute and fuzzy and obvious up there. Raccoons, either in a natural setting like this or maybe in your trash cans. And there's a lot of charismatic birds as well. A lot of people are familiar with these animals. A lot less people are familiar with reptiles and amphibians because they kind of represent what I would consider hidden biodiversity. Of course, a lot of reptiles and amphibians exhibit cryptic coloration or camouflage, makes them hard to see, like this gray tree frog on the stump or this rough green snake here in the shrubs, very difficult animals to find. But that doesn't mean that these animals aren't important, and it certainly doesn't mean that these animals are not abundant. During certain times of year and certain types of conditions, you may be able to find handfuls of rough green snakes around the edges of ponds or lakes or reservoirs. So these are really abundant components of our Kentucky environments. So brief introduction to amphibians. Probably most of you are familiar what what an amphibian is, but it's made up. Amphibians are made up of three groups or families. You have the frogs or the anurans, and toads are part of this. Toads are just a specialized type of frog. And then you have the salamanders, like this red salamander pictured below. And there's a group that probably less folks are familiar with, and these are the mostly tropical, limbless, worm-like amphibians known as caecilians. There's a lot of different amphibian species. 8,737 are known worldwide. And in fact, this is a little bit out of date because I looked at this morning and I think they added like 3 or 4 new amphibian species since I made this slide a couple months ago. Okay, so they're discovering new species all the time, scientists are, and there's lots of species. Most of this amphibian diversity is centered with the frogs. As there's 800 or so salamander species and 300 or 400 species of caecilians. So frogs are the dominant component of our amphibian diversity. Reptiles, again, most people are familiar with reptiles. It includes the snakes and lizards are actually kind of a combined group called the squamates. Then you have turtles and crocodilians, like the American alligator pictured here. And then there's this other group of these kind of strange lizard-like reptiles called tuataras, where depending on the authority, there's 1 or 2 species, and they're found in islands off the coast of New Zealand. There's over 12,000 different reptile species worldwide. And when we compare this with things like birds and mammals, we can see that amphibians and reptiles as a group outnumber birds and mammals. So there's a lot of diversity. And in Kentucky, we are kind of located in a biodiversity hotspot for amphibians and for reptiles in certain aspects as well. So this map shows amphibian and reptile biodiversity across the US. You can see that the darker shades of green have more species. So these southeastern and south central states, ranging from North Carolina to Texas, have really high reptile and amphibian biodiversity. But Kentucky has quite a number of species as well. You can see it has between 100 and 124, and in fact, it has 112 different species of reptiles and amphibians. We have 20 frogs and toad species here in Kentucky, 35 salamanders, 14 turtles, 10 lizards. Actually 8 native lizards, 2 are introduced, and 33 snake species here in Kentucky. Now, the diversity varies across the state. As master naturalists, you're probably familiar with this picture, this physiographic diagram of Kentucky, where in the western part of states, you have the Mississippi embayment or the Jackson Purchase, and in the eastern part of the state, you have the eastern Kentucky coal fields. Those 2 regions actually have the highest diversity. So in the Jackson Purchase or Mississippi embayment, you have a lot of species there. They're kind of found like in the southeastern coastal plain that kind of work their way up the Mississippi River. And we don't see these species in other parts of the state. Okay. And in the eastern Kentucky coal fields, that's kind of our salamander hotspot. So we have a lot of salamanders that are only found in that part of the state. So some basics here on what reptiles and amphibians are. And of course, I'm going to go through this very generally. But reptiles and amphibians are ectotherms. Sometimes it's popularly called cold-blooded, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bodies are cold or colder than that of mammals or birds, who are called endotherms. In fact, some reptiles reach higher body temperatures than that of mammals or birds. But it does mean that their body temperatures track the environment that they're in. So this is actually real data I'm showing here with temperature on the y-axis and time. And this is just over the course of July through September of the body temperatures of this mud turtle. And you can see when the mud turtle, which its body temperatures here are located in green on this graph, are in the blue, which is the water temperature, their body temperatures generally track the water temperature. Sometimes they're a little bit lower, sometimes they're a little bit higher. And then when this turtle comes onto land, which is located in the brown here, its body temperature is a little bit elevated over that of the soil temperature it's in. So it's tracking those environmental temperatures really well. And we see this for both reptiles and amphibians. Another aspect of importance when it comes to like their physiology and how they operate is moisture. This is especially important for amphibians. So amphibians need to have moist skin. And it's not just the fact that they like being in the water, but their skin is a very important respiratory organ. So amphibians breathe through their skin. They also drink through their skin as well. And so that skin has to be moist. So some amphibians, as I'll talk about, have lungs, others have gills, others don't have lungs or gills and just breathe completely through their skin. But even if they have lungs or gills, they're always respiring through their skin as well. So let's talk about some of these different groups we have here in Kentucky. And we're going to start today with some of the salamanders. And salamanders are some of my favorite animals. I've done a lot of research with salamanders. I just find that they're incredibly interesting and fun to work with. So we can kind of break our Kentucky salamanders up into 3 different groups. We have the first group, which are fully aquatic salamanders, meaning they're always found in streams or rivers or reservoirs in Kentucky, and they mostly stay in the water. And they mostly respire or obtain oxygen through their skin, okay? And we have some like the mud puppy here and the siren, which is a long eel-like salamander that has 4 limbs but no hind limbs. They have external gills, okay, where they're obtaining oxygen through the water with these external gills. We have others like our longest salamander in Kentucky that can reach, a couple feet, 3 feet, the Amphiuma, which will respire through its skin and has some gill slits. And then the hellbender, of course, which is our heaviest bodied salamander in Kentucky that can reach 2 to maybe 2.5 feet in length. They have gill slits, and they also have really small lungs, but all their respiration is done through their skin. And it's done because they have, well, here's a picture of me holding a hellbender, which gives you an idea of the size of these animals. This is from one of our sites in Kentucky. But back to breathing, you can see they have all these folds of wrinkly skin along the side of their body. And that increases their surface area of their skin so then they can effectively respire, okay? I provide some range maps throughout the presentation just to give you guys an idea of like where these animals can be found. The hellbender historically was kind of found statewide, but now it's kind of limited in its distribution to some of the larger rivers like the Green, Kentucky, and Licking, and some of their larger tributaries. Hellbenders are really neat. They have a really interesting reproductive strategy. Now, hellbenders are generally found under big flat rocks and rivers and streams, and they spend most of the year hiding under these rocks. At night, they'll kind of stick their head out, wait for a crayfish or a fish or a mud puppy or something to come by that they can eat. But during the breeding season, which happens here in Kentucky, starting in about August, the males kind of create these den sites underneath these flat rocks. They guard these den sites from other males, and they hope to attract a female to these den sites. The females, if they're enticed to enter these sites, will lay their eggs And the male hellbenders then will externally fertilize these eggs, and they'll guard these eggs from potential predators like fish and other hellbenders until these eggs hatch in November. We call these males that are guarding den masters. So they'll guard these nests throughout that breeding period. So our other groups of salamanders, we can kind of include these wetland breeders. And these are animals that breed and sometimes permanent, but most of the time like semi-permanent or ephemeral wetlands. And these animals, like the marbled salamander, which is pictured above, the spotted salamander, the tiger salamander, the eastern newt, generally migrate to these wetlands. And in this part of the state, most of them migrate in the winter or early spring months. They deposit their eggs in these wetlands after reproducing. And the adults then leave and move up to forests or sometimes prairies or areas like that, where they spend most of their time underground. The larvae, which is pictured here, has external gills. They eventually go through metamorphosis, losing those gills. Their mouth parts changes, some other aspects of their physiology change as well. And they metamorphose into little miniature versions of the adult, which then they leave the wetlands and move to the associated the forests that are nearby. So the eastern newt is something that probably many of you guys are familiar with. It's one of our more common salamanders in Kentucky. Pictured here is an adult that's in its aquatic form. So these are the types of animals that you see when you stick a net in a pond. They have these bright kind of red spots. Sometimes they're called the red-spotted newt. And you can see they're especially abundant in eastern Kentucky, but places like Land Between the Lakes, Mammoth Cave, and some other areas have really big newt populations. Now, you may see the adults if you look carefully, but most of you have probably seen the teenage version of the newt, the red eft, bright red in coloration. And these guys are just kind of wandering around the forest, usually on kind of damp, cool days. Now, they have this bright coloration because it serves as a warning to predators. Newts and all members of the family of Salamanderdae, which they're part of, are toxic or poisonous, right? So if you eat these animals, you would get sick. And so predators have learned to avoid eating newts, and the newts don't have a lot to fear, and that's why you see them tend to crawl around during the day. We call this in biology aposematic coloration, and it's a warning to predators like, don't eat me, I'll make you sick or I'll taste really bad. The newt kind of exemplifies this complex life cycle that I talked about a few slides earlier, where you have the adults in the wetlands. They'll lay their eggs in the wetlands. The eggs will hatch into the larval newts, which then will transform here into the red F stage, the teenage stage. And they can be in this teenage stage anywhere from 2 to 7 years before then they transform into the adult stage and re-enter the pond and reproduce. The newt's really cool and somewhat different than other salamanders because as an adult, if the pond dries up, we have a drought year, it's not supporting, it doesn't have any standing water, the newt then can transform into this terrestrial adult where it loses its tail fin, its skin actually changes to make it more resistant to drying up or desiccation. And then as these ponds refill, these terrestrial adults can enter them, their tail fins develop, and they become more aquatic. So just a really cool animal with a very complicated life cycle. Spotted salamanders are another good example of these pond breeding amphibians, pretty much found statewide except for parts of the inner bluegrass in Kentucky. Really beautiful salamanders with these yellow spots, orange spots on their head. Sometimes it's easy to find the adults, especially in the winter and spring following rains. They'll be around the wetlands or within the wetlands. So most of the time, they're underground and people don't see them. Their egg masses are quite prominent. So there's kind of these gelatinous egg masses that they lay. They'll kind of float in the wetland, sometimes attached to vegetation. You can see they're about the size of a tennis ball. And the eggs are protected by this jelly-like coating. So sometimes the wetlands they lay them in might go a little bit dry. The eggs are still protected from drying out. It also protects them from predators like newts that like to eat spotted salamander larvae. I think our final one that we'll talk about that's a pond breeding is salamanders, the marbled salamander, very common in eastern Kentucky. Its life cycle is a little bit different than some of our other salamanders that move to these wetlands in the winter or spring and lay their eggs. They actually move to these wetlands in the fall, so like in September, and they'll lay their eggs in wetlands that are completely dry. The female will stay with these eggs, and you can see the female here and the eggs around there. They'll stay with these eggs, usually underneath leaf litter or a log or a rock, until the fall rains come and these wetlands refill with water. And then the eggs will hatch and the larvae will grow throughout the winter and spring and undergo metamorphosis in late May or June. Oh, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the streamside salamander, which is one of our more interesting salamanders we have here in Kentucky. And it's interesting for a couple of reasons. You can see its distribution. It's very common in the bluegrass region. In fact, one of our most common salamanders. It is related to things like the spotted salamander, the marbled salamander. Most of our streamside salamanders breed in streams that dry usually in June or July. And they'll move to these streams in the late fall or the winter. They'll lay their eggs underneath a rock, and this rock is kind of turned over, and I placed the salamanders there so you can see that. And then the larvae hatch out and persist in streams like this one out at Raven Run Nature Preserve, where the larvae live and eat and eventually go through metamorphosis before that stream dries. These animals are interesting from a Kentucky standpoint too, because like this is their global distribution. This is everywhere where these animals can be found. When we compare something to like the spotted salamander, which can be found throughout the Midwest and Northeast and all the way down into Alabama and Georgia and the panhandle of Florida, this is the only place in the world where you find spotted salamanders. Over 60% of their global distribution is found in Kentucky, with most of that being in the bluegrass region. Our final group of salamanders that we'll talk about are the stream breeders, or not the final, the second to the last, are the stream breeders. These salamanders tend to be found in intermittent or first order streams. We have a lot of species richness of this group in eastern Kentucky. We have about 5 species of dusky salamander. We have several species, 4 species of what we call brook salamanders in the genus Eurycia, like this long-tailed salamander. And we have some larger salamanders like the spring salamander. All these animals lay their eggs in springs or streams or seepage areas next to these streams. And they have a complex life cycle where the larvae have gills and they eventually go through metamorphosis. The red salamander is a good example of a stream breeding salamander. It's a really beautifully colored animal that's found mostly in eastern Kentucky and in the Knobs region, although there are some populations in far western Kentucky as well. They will lay their eggs in the stream, usually in the winter time. And then sometime in mid-spring, they move up to the forest and sometimes can be found a couple hundred feet away from the streams under rocks or logs. A similar looking species to the red salamander is the spring salamander, Gyronophilus porphyriticus. So one of our larger stream-associated salamanders in Kentucky, big bulgy eyes, usually salmon colored with small speckles of black along the body. And like most amphibians, these salamanders will kind of eat whatever they can fit in their mouth. So here's a spring salamander eating a dusky salamander at one of my study sites. And I've individually marked animals at my study sites using a little tattoo method. And this animal is eating a dusky salamander. I could turn it over on its belly. I could see the tattoo of the dusky salamander showing through the salamander's belly, and I could figure out who just got eaten in this population. The southern two-line salamander is our most common stream-associated species found throughout Kentucky, usually in forested areas, but sometimes they persist in kind of forested suburban areas as well as agricultural areas. Their larvae, which are pictured here, are really common. You can still see those 2 lines along their back. They have kind of external gills that are reddish in color. The adult males during the breeding season have kind of enlarged jaw musculature, where they use to kind of fight off other males. They will locate a female. The female will lay their eggs underneath the rocks, and the females and sometimes the males will guard these eggs from predators. They generally see these eggs in April and May here in Kentucky. Now, our final group of salamanders are the terrestrial ones. They have no larvae. So these animals will lay their eggs, usually in some kind of moist, protected environment, like a rocky crevice, or under logs or under leaf litter. And the adults, females, will stay with these eggs until they hatch. And the babies hatch out as miniature versions of the adult. So here's an adult green salamander here, one of our climbing salamanders here in Kentucky, and here's a newly hatched young, you can see on the dime, so pretty small in size. So a slimy salamander is a great example of one of these terrestrial salamanders we have in Kentucky, found statewide, pretty large, probably up to like 6 inches in total length, bright white spots on a black background, black or grayish background coloration. Its name is a little misleading because it's not really slimy, but it's really sticky. So if you pick one up, it excretes this glue-like substance from its skin glands, and it's really kind of actually hard to get off your skin. It usually takes a couple days to kind of just wear off. But this is an anti-predator mechanism. So if you think you're like a garter snake, you want to eat a slimy salamander, well, you better get ready for something really sticky in your mouth. And in fact, I've seen pictures of garter snakes trying to eat them and then letting them go because it's just too sticky for them to eat. I should mention that all these terrestrial salamanders we have here in Kentucky are part of the lungless salamander group, where they respire entirely through their skin, so they don't have any lungs. And this is the most diverse group, both in Kentucky and worldwide, are these lungless salamanders. So let's talk about some frogs here. We have 20 species in Kentucky. Tree frogs, various species, toads, spadefoot toads, narrowmouth toads, true frogs are just some of them. American toad is one that most of you are probably familiar with. It's the toad that occurs throughout the state. Good identifying characteristics for the American toad are that if you see on its back or dorsum here, it has these little kind of black outlines. In the American toad, most of these outlined areas just have 1 or 2 warts. Okay, we have another closely related species of toad called the Fowler's toad, but they generally have 3 or more warts within each black spot. Also, American toads have, and our Fowler's toads as well, have these big glands kind of behind their eyes. They're called parotoid glands. They excrete kind of a distasteful poison that will make animals drop these toads and not want to eat them. Sometimes people's dogs pick them up as well. But these parotoid glands are kind of separated from the eye in this crest called a cranial crest in the American toad, where they're kind of pushed up against that cranial crest in the Fowler's toad. See if the audio works here. But, the really cool thing about frogs is people can monitor them by just kind of listening, going out on a spring or summer night. And this is the call of the American toad, and this long, drawn out trill that lasts about 30 seconds. Males are vocalizing here to attract the females. And American toads in Kentucky will call between usually March through July. And they're tadpoles. Their eggs are laid as these long string-like egg masses, and the tadpoles are usually like jet black in coloration. Another real common frog we have here in Kentucky is the Cope's gray tree frog, found throughout the state. Kind of has a warty, rough appearance to its back. Now, these tree frogs, like a lot of our frogs, can kind of change colors. So sometimes, at night, especially when they're vocalizing, they'll be kind of a light green. But oftentimes you see them as this gray color. Sometimes it's really cold, they'll be a darker gray or almost brown in coloration. Really large toe pads. A good defining characteristic of Cope's gray tree frogs is they have this bright yellow underneath on the underside of their legs. They have a pretty harsh trill. And they'll call a lot on rainy nights, sometimes not just from wetlands, but sometimes just puddles, roadside ditches, bird baths, the edge of ponds, things like that, anywhere where there's a little bit of standing water. And we have the spring peeper, which is probably our loudest frog here in Kentucky, really loud vocalization. Of course, as spring peepers can be heard from a mile away on a night where it isn't too windy, but a small frog, maybe only like an inch in total length. Their scientific name is Pseudacris crucifer, and crucifer means cross-bearing. So a lot of spring peepers have kind of this X on their back. Not all of them do that, but a lot of them have that. You can see it's found statewide, and they have this peeping-like call. This is just a few individuals calling. But if you're ever in a chorus of spring peepers, you can't really hear anything else around you because these animals are so loud with this vocalization. Now, one of our true frogs that probably many of you are familiar with is the American bullfrog, our largest frog here in Kentucky, and really the largest frog in North America. These frogs, like most of our true frogs, have really elongate limbs, powerful jumpers, great at swimming. Bullfrogs are very aquatic, so they spend most of their time in the water, and you'll hear their vocalizations this time of year, just kind of a low call. Some people describe it as sounding like jug o' rum. One cool thing about a lot of our true frogs is you can differentiate the males from females by looking at what's called the tympanum. This is kind of the frog's ear. So the male's tympanums are much larger than the females. They're generally larger than the eye, where the females are smaller. So this is a picture of a female bullfrog here. Now, one thing that a lot of our true frogs do is they just don't call to vocalize to attract mates. Sometimes they call for other reasons. And bullfrogs and green frogs are known for these distress calls. So this is a distress call of an American bullfrog. This is a call it would make when it's being swallowed by like a water snake or attacked by another predator. And the idea behind this is it's thought that this call will kind of create a chaotic situation. Like maybe if a snake's eating it, the frog will make this distress call. Then a raccoon will hear that, come over there, it'll create chaos, and maybe the frog will get away. So here's the distress call of the bullfrog. So pretty exciting. If you ever hear one of those out in the field, it's a very interesting call to hear. I want to bring up this other frog that probably most of you haven't seen here in Kentucky, but it's a really unique frog called the crawfish frog. This species is considered in conservation need, a species of greatest conservation need in Kentucky, because it's associated with some of our remnant prairie habitats. Now, this frog, as you can see, is found in Western Kentucky. And we have good populations in places like the West Kentucky Wildlife Management Area and some other areas here in the Jackson Purchase and the Western Kentucky coalfields. It gets its name because it spends almost all year round in crayfish or crawfish burrows. So these animals will live in these burrows, sometimes a mile away from where they breed, and they kind of sit in there at night. They may climb out of the burrow, eat some stuff, and then during the day they go back into the burrow. But usually here in Kentucky in late February through March, usually after heavy rains, they'll leave these burrows, they'll migrate to those wetlands, they'll call for a couple nights, they'll lay eggs as pictured here, they have a snoring call, and then the adults will move out and go back to their crawfish burrow, traveling sometimes great distances. So here's the call of the crawfish frog. Light call. Some American toads in the background. Really neat frog, really special frog here in Kentucky. So when we think about managing for amphibians, before I get talking about some reptiles, some things are really important. You have to keep in mind that amphibians prefer like cool, moist environments. So disturbances to forests or other areas where there's moisture, usually amphibians don't do well with that. So if you want to think about managing for these animals, allowing leaf litter, dead trees, woody debris to kind of naturally compose on the forest floor all promotes this cool, moist environment which these animals can live in. And also minimizing like soil disturbance to protect these microhabitats is important. Number of times you see road ruts or just muddy spots in roads, and these kind of serve as these ephemeral wetlands that are really important for these animals. They also are fun to drive ATVs through and things like that. But doing this disturbs these environments and disturbs these animals. So kind of minimizing this where you can is an important management component for frogs. There's just some woody debris, maintaining forests around cliff lines and other rocky areas can really benefit some of our lungless salamanders. Probably the most important thing we can do for amphibians in Kentucky is really allow for the persistence of ephemeral wetlands that are, these wetlands fill seasonally. So this is the same wetland during, winter, early spring, and this is the wetland in fall. So these dry out completely. And this is really important for a lot of amphibians because they lack fish and other predators that really like to chow down on amphibians. So maintaining these wetlands is a critical component to conserving these animals. But it's not just the wetland that's important. Amphibians, as I mentioned, migrate away from these wetlands and move into the forest. So sometimes after they undergo metamorphosis, they'll move 200 or more meters away. And a study done looking at 6 different salamander species, some of these data were collected from Kentucky, they move about 164 meters or 500 feet away from these wetlands. So maintaining these areas around wetlands and forests or other habitats specific to the species can really benefit these animals as well. Max distance recorded 625 meters, and sometimes they move a great deal, a great ways away from these wetlands, up to 1 kilometer. So kind of maintaining connectivity within the landscape can be really important. There has been studies looking at how much land we need to preserve wetlands for these animals and preserve forested areas for these animals, and it's shown that like preserving about a 290 meter buffered area that's largely undisturbed is the best for amphibians. So in Kentucky, we have 13 species of turtles. And Anna, I don't know if there's any comments or questions right now, but if there's any amphibian specific comments or questions in the chat, people could ask.
I do have one question, and
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and ask it because I know that everyone else is wondering this too. For the purpose of studying them, how do you tattoo a salamander?
Oh, well, I use this stuff it's called visible implant elastomer. And so use like a small syringe and you insert it like right underneath the skin. And this elastomer starts off as a fluid, but then turns into kind of like a really flexible rubber after it like kind of hardens underneath the skin. And then it fluoresces under black light. So then you can catch an animal. And even if it's kind of a darkly pigmented animal, you can shine a black light on it, and then you can see the placement of this tattoo, what color it is. So we use a different color coding combinations in different places on the amphibian's body to identify individuals. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's definitely the coolest thing I've heard today.
So let's talk a little bit about turtles. So 13 species found in Kentucky. We have both aquatic. Most of our turtles are aquatic. We have some that are a little more terrestrial, like the box turtle. We have things like the soft-shelled turtle, the red-eared slider, river cooters, and they inhabit places from ponds to wetlands to a lot of our larger rivers and streams. People are always really interested in snapping turtles, which is one of our largest turtles here in Kentucky, with adults getting up, ranging from 30 pounds to 35 pounds, but sometimes big individuals might get up to 50 pounds. And they're found statewide. As you can see, probably every farm pond in Kentucky may harbor some snapping turtles, common snapping turtles. But they're interested in snapping turtles because they're interested in the comparison with our other species of snapping turtle, the alligator snapping turtle. Now, the alligator snapping turtle is a very limited distribution in Kentucky, found mostly in the western part of the state. This one up near Frankfurt was found a few years ago. We're not sure if it was released or if it naturally occurred there, but most observations occur in the western part of the state. Alligator snapping turtles can get a lot larger than common snapping turtles. They have a lot larger head here. And then in this picture, you can see an alligator snapping turtle next to a common snapping turtle. And they also have a little fleshy lure that's associated with their tongue. So an alligator snapping turtle will stay underwater, open its mouth, move that lure around like a little worm. A fish will see that, think it has a nice meal, and the snapping turtle will close its mouth on it. A lot of people think they see alligator snapping turtles throughout the state, but most of the time they're just seeing really large common snapping turtles, as the alligator snapping turtle is very rare. By the way, you can hold an alligator snapping turtle like this because its head is so large it can't turn around and bite you. You cannot hold a common snapping turtle like this because its neck is long, its head is smaller, and it will turn around and bite you. If you ever have to move one or pick one up, you can pick it up from the rear part of the carapace or the top shell and move it that way for a common snapping turtle. Pond slider is another one of our really common species here. Sometimes it's called the red-eared slider as well, but they don't always have red ears. And sometimes they lack all coloration in general. So we call these melanistic sliders, which the males oftentimes exhibit that melanism, especially as they age. Again, a super common turtle. Oftentimes people see them moving around in the summer months, and those are generally females leaving wetlands to nest on land. Their carapace isn't really anything spectacular, but it often has kind of rays of yellow in it, and its plastron can range from being heavily marked to lacking any markings on there, but they oftentimes have these kind of donut-shaped markings along the bottom of the carapace or the top shell. Now, box turtles, some of my favorite turtles we have in Kentucky, really common. They're our most terrestrial turtle we have. The males and females are pretty easy to differentiate. You got the males are usually brightly colored, usually have orange, red on them, oftentimes have red eyes or orange eyes. The female are a little less brightly colored, have a higher domed carapace, have brown eyes. Generally less colored. If you look at their plastrons, the males have an indentation here on the bottom of the shells, and the females are just flat. And if you look at the map of the eastern box turtle, it's found throughout Kentucky. You can see this line here, and you probably saw that on the slider map as well. That's the Western Kentucky Parkway, and that's where our state herpetologist has collected a lot of data on these turtles as they're crossing the road. Now, I want to bring up one important aspect of turtles in general, that people do see them crossing the road, okay? And oftentimes these turtles are picked up off the road and moved to what is perceived to be like a less threatening environment, like a preserve or a park. And it's usually done by really well-meaning people. But the problem is these turtles, especially box turtles, have very specific home ranges. So we did a study to look at what happens when you move resident turtles or when you move turtles and how that compares to a resident population. So this is a resident turtles and its movement here, and it's paired with a relocated turtle. This box right here shows the entire area shown here for the resident turtle. So we can see it has really limited movement, stay within a really small area, where the relocated animal that was moved onto this preserve just kind of wandered. And the relocated turtles travel an average straight line distance from the release point that was twice as far. If we look at what their home ranges look like, I won't go through this in great detail, but the home range of a resident turtle is pretty small. 2.8 hectares, size of a football field. Average home range for a turtle that was moved on to this preserve was much larger, okay, 18.26. On top of it, turtles that were moved onto this preserve experienced 40% mortality, whereas the resident turtles that we studied experienced no mortality. So it's not the best conservation strategy to move turtles when you see them crossing a road. Oh, I'll drop it off, 3 miles away in this nature preserve, because these turtles will try to get back to their original home range. The best strategy is just to move them on the other side of the road, because they usually have a good idea of where they're going. Now to some lizards and snakes. So in Kentucky, we have 8 species of lizards native and 2 are introduced. Our lizards range from things like the fence lizard to the legless lizard here, which is a lizard. It looks like a snake, but it lacks limbs, but it does have external ear openings that all lizards have, and it does have eyelids that it can close like all lizards have. Snakes lack exterior ear openings and lack eyelids. They just have a protective scale over their eye. Our 2 introduced species are the Mediterranean house gecko, which is found in a lot of urban areas here in Kentucky, including in Lexington, including the Fayette Mall actually has populations of the Mediterranean house gecko. And then the European wall lizard, which 10 individuals were released into the metro area Cincinnati back in the 1950s. And now it's a very common lizard in that metro area, including lots of parts of northern Kentucky. So probably the lizards you're most likely to see in Kentucky, and probably the most confusing lizards, are the skinks. So we have 5 species of skinks. They tend to be kind of smooth scaled, shiny bodies. They often have blue tails, especially when they're young. Really hard to tell the difference between different species, and you almost have to catch them to look. This picture here looks very similar. These are 2 different species. One is called the common 5-line skink, and one is the broadhead skink. And the way you tell these 2 animals from one another is you have to count the scales on their lips, called labial scales. So the common 5-line skink has 1, 2, 3, 4. The broadhead skink has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a bigger head. It has more scales. That's really the only way you can differentiate between these animals. And then from our broadhead and common 5-line skink, there's another one called the southeastern 5-line skink, which has 4 scales on its lips, but it has a broader center scale row on its tails. So lizards can be pretty tricky. You almost have to catch them to see them, or the skinks in particular. But you have to catch them to ID them, I'm sorry. But yeah, they're an important component of our forest areas and kind of forest edges here in Kentucky. So now snakes, which I'm sure everybody's interested in. In Kentucky, we have 29 non-venomous species, okay? And just some general things, which works pretty good here in Kentucky, does not work globally. So if you travel to the tropics or something, don't use these same characteristics. But our non-venomous species tend to have a round pupil. They tend to kind of have a narrow neck and a narrow head compared to our venomous species. That head shape is pretty important here in Kentucky, although I would say that some of our non-venomous species, when they get irritated, like the northern water snake, can kind of flare out its head and give its head a bigger shape, okay? Our venomous species tend to have kind of these elliptical or vertical pupils. All of our species of venomous, which are 4 in Kentucky, are members of the pit viper group. So they have these heat sensing pits located kind of between the nostril and the eye, and that allows them to use thermal detection for prey capture. So we have 4 different venomous species. Now, to hold that venom, they have to have venom glands. So they tend to have these glands up here, and it gives their head kind of a wider appearance. There's a lot of other characteristics that if we had more time, we could talk about in identifying snakes, but other important characters are whether their scales are smooth or what we call keeled, and a keeled scale has a little ridge through it and gives the snake more of a rougher appearance. Another important characteristic is looking at the scales on their anal plate. So this is where their cloaca is located. That's where they excrete, and that's where their reproductive organs are located. But there's a scale that kind of protects that cloaca, and some species have just 1 scale and some have 2, a divided anal plate. Now, I won't go into all those details today, but those are good characteristics if you look at snakes, try to ID different species. So of our venomous species, the most common ones we have here in Kentucky is the northern copperhead, Echistrodon contortrix. Beautiful snake with these hourglass shaped patterns on its body, found throughout Kentucky, with the exception of some of the bluegrass counties and a few other counties. Very common in eastern Kentucky, very common in land between the lakes. You can see here they have relatively short fangs that kind of fold up in the back of their mouth. Like all our venomous species, if you were to get bitten by a copperhead, go to the hospital, have somebody drive you there. Although there's never been a reported death from a copperhead envenomation for a person here in Kentucky. The juveniles tend to have these kind of bright yellow tail tips, almost like a neon yellow. And it's thought that they use those, kind of move them around to lure lizards and other prey items close to the snake so they can envenomate it and swallow it. One interesting thing about copperheads here in Kentucky is they love eating cicadas. So during cicada emergent times, these copperheads will trail the nymphs up the trees, sometimes eating the nymphs and sometimes eating the adults as they undergo the molting. And so there's lots of some studies done in the Red River Gorge area on the relationship between copperheads and cicada numbers. Another venomous species here in Kentucky is the western cottonmouth. Now, one thing I just want to point out about the cottonmouth is that it's really only found in western Kentucky, and it's really not that common in western Kentucky. All the time, people report to me that they've seen cottonmouths in eastern Kentucky and central Kentucky. And unless somebody's released one, they just don't occur there. But most people are seeing are northern water snakes, which again will flatten out their heads, kind of make themselves look scary, sometimes are uniform in color, and can easily get confused with cottonmouths. But cottonmouths have a pretty distinctive threat display where they open their mouth here. As you can see in this picture, it's white on the inside, which gives them their common name. Another good characteristic that usually works for cottonmouths, especially compared to water snakes, is they tend to swim above the water with kind of their heads elevated. So this can kind of help with ID. Our other venomous species is a timber rattlesnake, found throughout Kentucky except the bluegrass region. Probably historically was found throughout the state. But in areas where there's heavy amounts of agriculture or urbanization, these snakes don't do well, mostly because they announce their presence through rattling, and then they're easily killed. But it's a real sign of wilderness to see a timber rattlesnake in Kentucky. And we do have pretty good populations in Kentucky, especially compared to some of our neighboring states. Our final venomous species is the pygmy rattlesnake. This is a tiny little rattlesnake. Here's a younger one, but you can see its size in relation to a quarter here. Only really found in land between the lakes area. They make a sound kind of like a buzzing insect when they rattle, and it's an increasingly rare species in Kentucky. Both the cottonmouth, timber rattlesnake, and pygmy rattlesnake are all considered species of greatest conservation need in Kentucky. Now, we have a lot of non-venomous species. We have things like these small woodland snakes, worm snakes, red-bellied snakes, smooth earth snakes, ringneck snakes. All these rarely get over like 8 inches in total length. All of them live in leaf litter. All of them eat mostly invertebrates, sometimes taking an occasional salamander. All of them are probably much more abundant than we know of, because during certain times of year and certain conditions, it's not uncommon to find a whole bunch of ringneck snakes out and about or underneath shale or other cover. At other times of year, they're underground and they can just be really hard to find. Now, most of you have probably seen one of our largest snakes in Kentucky, the gray rat snake, found statewide. Our record size in Kentucky is 7 feet 1 inch, and these are snakes that are found in everywhere from suburban areas to forest to agricultural lands. They're good at climbing. They can be up in trees or attics or people's garages, but they're also somewhat terrestrial as well. They lay eggs, usually in late June. The eggs hatch in August or September. The young look a lot different than the adults. The young are really heavily patterned, where the adults tend to have less patterning on their body. Now, gray rat snakes are constrictors. So they'll capture a potential prey item, whether it be a mouse or a bird. They'll grab it with their mouth. They'll wrap their body around it. And as this animal breathes, it kind of tightens up more and more. But a snake is all one giant muscle. So it's not just suffocating this animal, it's kind of feeling where this animal's heart is, and they can push all the blood in the animal to the heart, causing instant heart attack, and then they can swallow the prey item without risk of injury. All these different methods a snake uses to capture prey, whether it's in envenomation or constriction, all have to do with safely capturing these animals. Remember, snakes don't have limbs or claws or things like that, so they can't really fight back effectively. So they have to capture prey in safe ways. Now, one of my favorite snakes in Kentucky is the hognose snake, and it doesn't constrict, but it kind of just grabs onto things, especially amphibians and especially toads, and it has elongate teeth in the back of its mouth where it can kind of puncture the toad. Now, the toad's defensive strategy is to fill up with air, make itself look really big. Hognose snake just grabs onto it, kind of deflates it, and swallows it whole like that. Now, hognose snakes are also really cool because they have a lot of elaborate defensive mechanisms or anti-predator mechanisms. If you find a hognose snake in the wild, it'll start off by hooding up like a cobra, hissing, striking with its mouth open, with its mouth closed, so it's not really trying to bite. If that doesn't work, it'll make itself look really disgusting, or release feces and kind of smear it on the body. If that doesn't work, it'll throw up its last meal. If that still doesn't work, it'll roll over on its back and play dead. And these defensive tactics are thought to confuse a predator and think like, man, there's something really wrong with this animal. Maybe I'll find a meal someplace else. So it's really cool to find one of these in the wild where they undergo all their defensive strategies. The final snake that I'll talk about is non-venomous, and this is the eastern black king snake. A lot of people are interested in this snake, especially people who are kind of don't like snakes, but kind of understand their ecological importance, because king snakes are well known for eating other snakes and well known for eating venomous species. So here's a king snake pictured eating a copperhead. And we have records of king snakes catching copperheads, being bitten twice by the copperhead, showing no ill effects of the venom, and then swallowing the copperhead. When you think about it, nothing fits inside a snake better than another snake. So a lot of snakes actually eat other snakes because they fit well inside their body. But an important snake, and like I said, a lot of people like king snakes that don't really necessarily like other snakes. So in the final minutes here, I know we're running a little bit long, but I think we started a little bit late. But when you think about managing for snakes and lizards and sometimes turtles, it's really important to kind of maintain a diversity of forest classes within an environment. Like you may have areas where there's snags or a disturbance in the forest. This allows for more solar penetration, and this allows for like basking sites for these animals. So having diversity or heterogeneity in the forest is really important for these animals. This is one of our sites out at Berea Forest, where they've done some silviculture techniques for oak management, and they kind of open up the forest in these areas. But after they open it up, lots of reptiles use these sites. Like I said, snags can be really important as basking sites for these animals. And the final thing I'll just say is that sometimes people ask me, like I was just asked to contribute to an article for the Herald Leader, what do you do if you don't want snakes around your house for whatever reason? I thought it was kind of crazy. I like having snakes around my house, but the things that people want to do to keep snakes away is, keep your lawns neat and tidy. That doesn't provide good habitat for these snakes. Eliminating things like piles of rock or wood that not only attracts snakes, but attracts their prey, like mice, is a good idea. And then I'm removing potential food like feeders, especially like bird feeders during the summer months when snakes are active, because that attracts other prey and that will attract the snakes. If you remove the prey and you remove the hiding spots, it's generally not good snake habitat. If you want snakes, keep rock piles in your yard, and then the snakes usually like that. Final thing, just a couple resources here. A website through UK Forestry Extension on Kentucky snakes ID is a really helpful place where it goes through all the different species in Kentucky, some aspects of their natural history. It allows you to ID snakes that you may not sure what they are. You can ID your snake, you can submit records of these snakes to a database, and it can help us track their geographic distribution. And for those of you interested in managing for reptiles and amphibians, maybe on your property, organization called the Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation has come up with habitat management guidelines. uh, for regions throughout the US, but we'd be in the southeastern region, and it's available for free from a southeast part at separk.org. So the website will be here. So on that, Anna, I don't know if there's time for questions, but I appreciate everybody listening. And if you have any general herp questions, you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer those.
Awesome. That was so cool. I love just the diversity, especially of the amphibians in Kentucky, just never stops blowing my mind. Like it's just incredible. And probably kind of on that subject, David is out here asking the $1,000,000 question real quick as we're wrapping up. Have we seen or do we expect to see a significant impact on these amphibian and reptile species due to climate change?
I think climate change will likely lead to changes in precipitation patterns, whether it be extensive dry periods or floods, both of which can impact these populations. If you're an animal that lives in a stream, for example, like a dusky salamander, and we have these huge deluges of rain, it serves as kind of like a mechanism to flush these animals downstream into the higher order streams where they're eaten by fish. Of course, if it's extended dry periods, reproduction isn't successful and it can impact these animals. In terms, reptiles need water too, especially our turtles, but they need water to drink. And I think dry periods can be pretty stressful on them, can also affect their prey. A lot of them eat amphibians, and if amphibians aren't doing well, these animals won't. And when it comes to like their limits in terms of body temperatures, amphibians have a relatively low body temperature requirement. That means it's mostly because the hotter they get, that means they're in the sun, they dry up quicker. So they'd probably be more impacted from like a body temperature position than a snake or lizard or turtle would.
For sure. Yeah, definitely some things to, think about. And I'm sure for you all, keeping an eye on going into the future. But
Yeah.
cool, very cool. Well, Dr. Price, we really appreciate you popping on today. That was really informative. That was just absolutely fascinating. A lovely way to spend a lunch break. So we greatly, greatly appreciate you coming on and sharing that with us. If you are watching right now, I just dropped the Kentucky Snake ID page on the extension site into the chat. And I also dropped the link to the Price Lab, which is Dr. Price's lab at the University of Kentucky in the chat. If you're watching this on the replay, then I'll put those both in the description box on the YouTube video, so you have easy access to those. And that has some information on how to contact the folks at the Price Lab as well if you have any, kind of burning follow-up questions about reptiles and amphibians. So having said all that, I know we're running up on our time, so I will go ahead and let you all go. Keep an eye out for the re-upload if there's anything that you feel like you want to review or that, you have other folks that want to watch it. And otherwise, we'll see you again for our next installment of the webinar series. Thank you, Dr. Price. We appreciate it.
Thank you.